Let's kick things off with Benjamin Harrison, a name so forgettable most Americans would probably mistake him for an old-timey banker or some guy who went down with the Titanic. But Harrison left a big mark by tanking the economy and ghosting the nation before the fallout hit. In 1890, he passed the McKinley Tariff, which hiked import duties up to nearly 50%. It was supposed to protect American businesses, but instead it made prices explode, foreign trade nosedive, and farmers suffer big time. And just to make things worse, Harrison blew through the entire federal surplus like a lottery winner on day one. The kicker? The full economic meltdown didn't come until after he left office. The Panic of 1893 hit on President Grover Cleveland's watch, but it was Harrison's mess all along. Meanwhile, Harrison was back home in Indiana, sipping tea and writing memoirs like he hadn't just wrecked the place. So no, Benjamin Harrison didn't start any wars or break any laws, but he sure played economic Jenga and walked away before it all fell down. But believe it or not, that's not nearly as bad as what Millard Fillmore did, when he basically deputized every citizen as a slave catcher. Back in 1850, America was split on slavery. The South was thriving on it. The North, not so much. With tensions threatening to tear the country apart, Fillmore thought he'd cool things off with a compromise, and he blew it. Enter the Fugitive Slave Act. It made it a federal crime not to assist in capturing runaway slaves. That's right. If someone showed up on your porch seeking freedom and you offered them a drink of water, you could land in jail. Even in states where slavery was banned. Absolutely wild. And of course, this didn't bring peace. Instead, it radicalized everyday folks who had never given slavery much thought. Suddenly, the abolitionist movement exploded, and moderates turned into activists overnight. Fillmore thought he was keeping the Union together. But really, he threw gasoline on the fire and nudged the nation closer to civil war. Still, even that disaster wasn't as embarrassing as what happened to William Henry Harrison, who holds the record for the shortest presidency ever. In 1841, William Henry Harrison was 68 years old, which back then was practically ancient. So to prove he had the stamina, he delivered the longest inaugural address in history, nearly 2 hours long, while standing in the freezing cold without a coat or hat. Total grandpa on a skateboard energy. Within weeks, he came down with a nasty illness. Not pneumonia, as we used to think, but likely typhoid from contaminated DC water. Whatever the cause, 31 days into his term, he was dead. He didn't sign a single bill or make a single decision. The man spent more time writing his speech than actually being president, and his death triggered a constitutional mess. Back then, it wasn't clear if the vice president became president or just kind of filled in. John Tyler decided, screw it, I'm president now. And everyone just sort of shrugged and agreed. Harrison's legacy? No scandals, no triumphs. Just one very long speech and a very short presidency. But at least he didn't come close to destroying the country, like Franklin Pierce, who actually did. Pierce looked like a movie star and spoke like a preacher, but his presidency was a train wreck. He got elected in part to deal with the growing slavery crisis. His solution? The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It turned a bunch of unsettled land from the Louisiana Purchase into official U.S. territories. Sounds fine. Except the law let residents vote on whether to allow slavery, effectively canceling the Missouri Compromise that banned slavery above a certain line. The result? Pro- and anti-slavery groups flooded into Kansas, armed to the teeth. It didn't take long for the territory to explode into violence. Homes were torched, families were killed, and bleeding Kansas became a full-blown Civil War preview. And what did President Pierce do? He sided with the pro-slavery faction, the one that used fraud and bloodshed to install a sham government. He even sent in federal troops to back them up, so instead of calming the national tension, Pierce threw it into overdrive. He took a volatile situation and made it worse, pushing America faster toward war. But you know who might surprise you on this list? Woodrow Wilson. He's remembered as the idealist who brought us the League of Nations and promised to make the world safe for democracy. But here's the dark side. During World War I, he signed the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, laws that made it illegal to criticize the government, the military, or even the American flag. That's straight-up authoritarian. And it happened. More than 2,000 Americans were prosecuted under Wilson, including journalists and union leaders. Meanwhile, Wilson was obsessed with creating the League of Nations, a new global organization to keep peace. But when he brought the plan to the U.S. Senate, they rejected it, worried it would drag us into more foreign conflicts. Wilson was stunned. The League went on without America, with 63 countries joining, just not us. And to make matters worse, Wilson helped write the Treaty of Versailles, which punished Germany so harshly it basically guaranteed World War II. In the end, Wilson got so locked into his vision of the world that he ignored reality and left the country and the planet worse off. And if Wilson got stuck in his own dream world, George W. Bush just got hit with every real-world disaster imaginable, short of an alien invasion. He came into office with a wink and a handshake, but history handed him 9/11 within his first year. And to his credit, he did rally the nation in the aftermath, for a little while. But after that, things spiraled. First came the war in Afghanistan, and then the big one, the invasion of Iraq. Based on claims that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, the U.S. launched a full-scale war. Problem is, those weapons didn't exist. But by the time that became clear, we were already knee-deep in a trillion-dollar war that cost over 4,400 American lives, left tens of thousands wounded, and destabilized the region for decades. Thanks for nothing. And like Wilson, Bush didn't just mess things up abroad. He also chipped away at American freedoms at home. In the name of national security, Bush signed the Patriot Act, massively expanding government surveillance powers. The NSA and FBI could now spy on Americans, reading emails, tracking calls, all without a warrant. And sure, it felt necessary at the time. But fast forward to today, and we're still living in that surveillance state. Not exactly the legacy you want. Then came Hurricane Katrina. When the levees broke and New Orleans was underwater, the federal government's response was painfully slow. Thousands were stranded on rooftops. The Superdome turned into a nightmare. No power, no plumbing, no help. The scene looked more like a failed state than a U.S. city, and Bush was left looking clueless. So yeah, George W. Bush didn't just fumble one crisis. He fumbled multiple ones with consequences that are still unfolding today. But believe it or not, things were even worse right after the Civil War, when the country desperately needed healing, and instead got Andrew Johnson. Lincoln had just been assassinated. The nation was raw, divided, and needed a leader who could bring everyone together. But Johnson, a former slaveholder from Tennessee, had other ideas. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which would have guaranteed formerly enslaved people basic rights like citizenship and equal protection. His reason? He didn't believe in racial equality, plain and simple. Congress wasn't having it, though. They overrode his veto and passed the 14th Amendment to lock those rights into the Constitution. But Johnson didn't stop fighting. He issued mass pardons to tens of thousands of Confederate soldiers and leaders, basically welcoming them back into power like nothing had happened. Imagine rebelling against the United States, losing, and then being handed your political career back with a bow on top. Johnson's logic was that we shouldn't punish the South. But all it did was set the stage for the Jim Crow era, empower the KKK, and deepen the divide he was supposed to be healing. Congress finally had enough. They impeached him, the first time in U.S. history, and he barely survived removal by a single vote. Instead of helping the nation rebuild, Johnson made sure old wounds stayed open. He had one job: don't ruin Reconstruction. And he blew it. And then there's Herbert Hoover, who was supposed to be the golden boy of American progress. A self-made millionaire, a humanitarian, a respected public servant. People thought he'd lead America into a new era of prosperity. And to be fair, that might have happened, if the Great Depression hadn't arrived just months into his term. But here's the problem. Once the economy crashed, Hoover froze. He believed in rugged individualism, the idea that Americans should solve problems themselves, not rely on the government. So when banks failed, homes were lost, and bread lines wrapped around city blocks, Hoover just waited. He opposed direct relief programs, fearing they'd make people dependent on the state. So instead, he offered tax cuts to businesses, hoping it would trickle down. Spoiler, it didn't. Meanwhile, millions were out of work, and shanty towns known as Hoovervilles sprang up across the country, a not-so-subtle middle finger to the man in charge. He did eventually try a few programs near the end, but it was way too little, way too late. By the time Franklin D. Roosevelt took over, America was in its worst economic crisis ever, and Hoover's name was already a punchline. His presidency didn't just fail, it became the textbook example of what not to do during a crisis. James Buchanan stepped into the presidency in 1857, right as the country was tearing itself apart over slavery. He had a choice: lead boldly, take a stand, do something, or sit back and hope it all worked out. Instead, Buchanan picked the worst option imaginable. He passed the buck to the Supreme Court. That led to the infamous Dred Scott decision, which declared that Black Americans could never be citizens. And Buchanan? He applauded. To him, the issue was settled. Worse still, he didn't just stand by, he helped push it through. Behind the scenes, Buchanan lobbied justices to issue a sweeping pro-slavery ruling, hoping it would end the debate forever. Spoiler, it did the opposite. The North exploded in outrage. 3 years later, Abraham Lincoln, an outspoken critic of slavery's expansion, won the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote. Great job, Jimmy. The South freaked out. Faced with losing power, Southern states started to secede before Lincoln was even sworn in. And Buchanan, still in office, claimed secession was unconstitutional, but also insisted the federal government had no right to stop it. When Buchanan finally left office, 7 states had already left the Union, federal forts were being seized, and the U.S. was sliding straight into civil war. His legacy isn't marked by some huge scandal or disastrous bill. It's defined by paralysis in a moment when the nation needed action most. Yikes, surely it can't get worse than that, right? Wrong, because now we get to the worst president in American history, Warren G. Harding. A man so ill-equipped for the job, even he knew it. In private, Harding once confessed, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here." He wasn't lying. Harding campaigned on bringing America back to normalcy. Instead, he handed us the most corrupt administration ever assembled. He packed his cabinet with the Ohio Gang, a rowdy squad of drinking buddies, political flunkies, and con men who treated the government like an all-you-can-steal buffet. Case in point, the Teapot Dome scandal, where the Secretary of the Interior secretly sold off federal oil reserves to private companies in exchange for fat bribes. The head of the Veterans Bureau stole millions meant for wounded war vets. And Harding's Attorney General? He allegedly took payoffs while organized crime ran wild during Prohibition. Meanwhile, Harding himself spent his days golfing, drinking, and gambling, all while the country was legally dry. He even had multiple extramarital affairs while in office. This guy made corruption look like a lifestyle brand. At one point, he said, "I have no trouble with my enemies. It's my damn friends that keep me walking the floor at night." Maybe the stress caught up to him. Harding died suddenly of a heart attack in 1923, right in the middle of all the scandal. His death shocked the nation and exposed just how rotten things had gotten behind closed doors. Harding didn't just undermine public trust. He detonated it.